Afternoon, and thank you to those who have joined already. Issues around ethnicity pay reporting and the lessons that have been learned by two organisations where ethnicity pay reporting has actually been implemented. And they'll cover how it can be done and how the data can be used to drive change. So we're delighted to have with us today Dan Robertson from VERCIDA Consulting, who will host today's webinar and give us his thoughts on the current landscape and direction of travel. As well as Zaheer Ahmad, Head of Strategic Delivery, Diversity and Inclusion for Ernst Young, and Roger Dix, Chief Risk Officer and responsible at Wesleyan for Inclusion and Diversity. So they will both talk through their organisation's journey and the lessons learned in successfully implementing ethnicity pay reporting. But before I hand you over to our speakers, we're going to be running a confidential live poll throughout the webinar. We'll be asking you, the audience, to answer 4 questions that will give us some interesting insight, which we will share with you. Also, there's an opportunity for questions, so please do use the chat box during the webinar to ask your questions, which will be answered by the speakers at the end. So just to start things off, I'll ask the first question, which is: race inclusion is one of our key strategic diversity and inclusion priorities. So if you could just quickly complete the poll that will appear on your screen whilst I hand over to Dan.
Okay, Jonathan, thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Dan Robertson from VERCIDA Consulting. Okay, well, that's really interesting in terms of the poll results then, in terms of people thinking, whether race inclusion is one of your strategic priorities. Good to see that, 93% agreeing that it is, 9% not quite yet. And then it'd be interesting as we go through the Q&A later, in terms of the kind of neither agree nor disagree in terms of that 18. It's probably no surprise. I think obviously at the moment there is a big focus on race inclusion. I suppose it would have been super interesting to have seen those results prior to George Floyd and the conversations that organisations have had since then. Just in terms of very brief introduction to myself, so I head up a global consultancy company called VERCIDA Consulting. In addition to that, I'm the chair of the Lord Mayor of London's Power of Inclusion Network. My role is to really promote equality in a broad sense to many domestic and also global corporations. One of the things that we are very keen to do for a whole range of reasons in our role with the Lord Mayor of London is to really think about how we can promote race inclusion. Our headline campaign actually for the next 2 years is on social mobility, but particularly in the UK. When we look at the data sets, we know there are correlations between social background, race and ethnicity and the rest of it. So we're really keen to kind of interweave that. Just briefly, before I hand over to Roger as our first speaker, I think the landscape has changed actually on race inclusion. I think it's changed for 2 basic reasons. We're all familiar that 2020 has been an interesting year for many reasons actually. One obviously is COVID. We are all clearly doing this virtually. Prior to COVID, we'd be all hopefully in a nice room somewhere. I think the interesting thing about COVID is when we're looking at the data for 2 basic reasons. We know that there are disparities in relation to the impact of COVID-19 on BME groups, and the data is telling us a couple of interesting things. One is there is an impact disproportionately based on healthcare, but we also know and I think we need to be honest about this, is that in terms of the economic fallout of COVID is going to be harsh, and there's some really interesting research coming out now saying that actually some BME groups are going to be disproportionately impacted on in terms of redundancies and job losses and stuff like that. So I think as organisations, as we work through some strategic decision making, we've really got to keep an eye and a lens on race inclusion and think about those points of disproportionality in decision making. The obvious point, as I mentioned, also in addition to that, is George Floyd, and even though that is a primarily a US issue, I think the ripple effect of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protest has clearly been global. We've seen lots of CEOs and other leaders in the UK talk about their commitment to race equality. I'm old enough actually to remember the Macpherson inquiry into Stephen Lawrence. Actually, I was around in those days, and it's fair to say that Stephen Lawrence and the Macpherson inquiry was a watershed moment in terms of race equality in the UK. I don't think we've ever had another watershed moment until now. I do genuinely think that the George Floyd and the fallout of that is a watershed moment. So that puts a lot of emphasis on organisations to think about what you're doing around race inclusion. One of the key primary factors is around saying, well, how can we use data as a strategic enabler? And I think that's where the kind of ethnicity monitoring really comes in. And obviously that's the focus of this afternoon's session. So before I hand over to Roger, and Roger and Zaheer will be the primary focus as our expert speakers, we'll just quickly go into the second poll, actually. And the second poll, so the first one is obviously around, do we have a strategy? The second is really around monitoring. So do you monitor rates of BAME? And just so we're clear in terms of language, which is Black, Asian, and minority ethnic. So do you monitor rates of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic progression in your organisation? So let's see what the results of that might be. Okay, so this is super interesting, actually. So we've got, and I'm just going to quickly make a note of some of this because this will be useful in terms of the discussions later. So interesting there. So, lots of you talking about, in terms of the first poll question, 73%, race inclusion is one of your key strategic D&I priorities. Really interesting disparity in terms of monitoring progression. And that's obviously going to have an impact in terms of how well, do you know whether you're progressing and all of that. So we'll come back to that, and there's clearly implications in terms of ethnicity pay. So now I'm going to hand over to Roger Dix from the Wesleyan. I'll allow Roger just to introduce himself and talk about all the great stuff they're doing over there, and then we'll go to there. So Roger, over to you.
Many thanks, Dan, and afternoon all. As has been said, Roger Dix, my day job is the Chief Risk Officer of the Wesleyan, but my other day job, and actually the job I really enjoy, is being the exec sponsor for inclusion and diversity. You'll notice that the word HR doesn't appear in my title, and that's because Wesleyan took a stance right at the beginning, 3 years ago when we started doing this, that HR wasn't the right place to lead this work. We looked around at ourselves and the market we served and where we were situated. For those who don't know us, we're right in the centre of Birmingham. Birmingham, the most diverse city in the UK, and you wandered around and thought, really? You're in Birmingham? Well, where's the evidence? It looks like pale, male and stale. And so we knew we had something to do, so we set out on the journey, and it is a journey and it's a marathon. So there's no overnight successes here, I'm afraid. If you do, well done. But we set out there to sort of start changing perception and everything else. I still well recall and joke currently with our chairman, actually, it was his first board meeting with us. When I went to the board to present what we wanted to do, they kind of knew they had to say yes, but that was about as enthusiastic as it got. We got normal comments like, well, Roger, we always choose the right person for the job. It's always the best qualified. So I think we're all fine there. And to which my response now is, well, I'm sure you do, but how wide did you spread it in the first place? So what we did, it was a very textbook approach. We took advantage of the very large generosity there is in this field to speak to people who are already doing it, and my thanks to them. And we're now proud that we can also speak to people. And anyone on this call, if you want to pick your phone up or email me and ask Roger, can we have a quick conversation with you? I'd be delighted to do it, because that's how we all learn. The camaraderie in this whole space is great. We went to networks, so networks for each of the distinctive segment types, so gender, BAME, LGBT, and what we called well-being. And each of them then focused on their own areas. In theory, you didn't have to be of that area to be in it, but kind of the practice, it seems to be that you are. So gender tends to be females, there's very few males involved, etc. And we worked through there. Also from the start as the exec sponsor, I mean, it was a double act with HR, it's fair to say. I worked with the director of HR, but I was the lead face for it. From the start, I took a view that it would be too easy to just jump into the gender space and just focus on everything there. There's large amounts of things happening there, and that would be at the expense of everything else. The area which I think is still the most underdeveloped, and the space where we need most to do, is sadly the BAME space. And that has taken some time to get to. But if I look back on our 3 years, we've managed to change our dials on gender representation. We said we joined the 30% club and said we want to get 30% of our senior leaders, that's about the top 60, 70 people in a company of about 1,400 people, to be female. We started at 15, 16. We're just below 30 now, which is great. The challenge we always had on BAME targets was all of us actually don't really like targets, because the fear is if you have a target, you'll be promoted for the wrong reason, like you're part of the target rather than anything else. But the counter to that is they work. And the catalyst, which was this year for Black Lives Matter, was that it was clear we had to do something, and targets were now willingly accepted by all, and we had to bring them in. I would add, however, that let us not think that the problem on the whole racism thing is in the States. If we should look at ourselves in this country, speak to ethnic minority colleagues, or ask them to do some personal blogs or vlogs, they are very powerful. We found them very powerful at Wesleyan. Other firms have done the same. There is incipient racism around many things, how we act, do, and say. And so it's not just the American police. You can look and say, well, they're bad, aren't we? Brilliant, but this is a call to do it. No, we are equally bad in different ways, it's fair to say, in how we treat people, what we do there. And our ethnic minority colleagues, BAME colleagues, have been actually emboldened to speak out on this and give their examples. And there's some quite horrifying ones there, all low-level stuff. No, there's no violence there physically, but mental violence. The chair of our BAME network, her son went back to her car early, and someone said, oh, why are you attacking that person's car? She happened to have a BMW, so a smart car, ethnic minority going to black smart car, they thought it was attacking the car. Horrendous things like that. People being asked where you were born, which do you ask a white person where they're born? No, you don't. So I think there's loads of stuff there we can do. And the catalyst of this year has been that people are now speaking out. And so easy advice for all is try and think of webinars, blogs, to just sort of get this information out there and have people share their experiences, because people then can realize there is an issue and it is in this country. So having got our network set up, we sort of are able to do that there. The challenge, which is relevant for the wider topic of this, which is pay gap, is how do you get data? And over a couple of years now, we've gained our data. We've collected our ethnicity data on a confidential basis, which is clearly kept on a separate system. Our data gurus then combine the data on that system with our salary system to get data out of it. But let's be clear, having the data is one thing, but if you just have it, it's not worthwhile. You need to actually use it and proactively, not just look at it afterwards. So we're now in the stage at Wesleyan, we've got data, we're starting to use it. Some of our processes aren't exactly helpful to help us use it. So we thought we landed all new entrants to us, all our recruitment process, we could get the data, but we suddenly found that there was an open system, which everything was dumped, CVs and the whole works, where everyone could read it, so we didn't solve it there. So a few steps forward, but a few steps backward at the same time there. But over time, and the consequence of our actions, our network's actions, and change in society, I would have to say, plus a sort of somewhat changed board, a more diverse board. It was a full male board, it's now a very mixed board. We've got much more support at board and exec level, and people are keen to do it. to the extent that this year we have included in exec and senior leader managed balanced scorecards an explicit item on inclusion and what we're doing there and how we can, and are we going to hit our targets, etc. there. So we've made great progress in 3 years, loads more progress still to do, but we're getting there and we're learning all the time. I don't claim to get it right. The key thing I found with colleagues is just put your hands up and say, look, I'm going to screw up occasionally. I might say the wrong thing, which I don't mean to offend you, but if it does, just tell me. I can tweak my words accordingly. So we get on that way. I'll stop there. Happy to take any questions afterwards. I think I pass on to Zaheer now.
Actually, Roger, before you go into Zaheer, I've got a few questions for you.
All right, I'll get away that easily then, fine.
I mean, the first one is, I suppose, because I think a lot of people on the webinar might be interested in a couple of things. So one is just, I suppose, on the mechanics of data collection. You know, there's always this thing around, you know, nervousness. You know, people say, oh, well, you know, if I give you my data, you know, what are you going to do with it? Where is it going? And all of that. I mean, talk to us a bit about the process for capture. I mean, did you have to do a big comms piece? Did you have to reassure people that, you know, it's going to be placed in a secure database? Did you have any challenges in terms of capturing the data?
If we had any challenge, it was individual ones, and there was nothing systemic there. But the first two, yeah, big comms, big explaining what we're doing it. Plus, it was voluntary. We couldn't force anyone. We said that we'd like you to do it, and we also then had to go through the also philosophical debate, it seemed at times, as to ethnicity data. I mean, gender's one of the simpler ones, it's fair to say. But on the ethnicity, which splits, which groupings do you take? And we had to make a call as to where we thought the government might go, because we had an eye to the future. The government will require something from us, so what split, what sort of groupings of ethnicity might they ask for? So we made that one there. And asked people to include it as well. It also includes other items of relevance to diversity. So it's not just ethnicity we've asked for. We've asked for university, any person in family to go to university, sexuality we asked for, disability, religion, and everything else there. So we've got a database there, make it quite clear that it's separate there and isn't readily available to look. It's not on your personnel file, so to speak. It's a separate one there. So that's landed okay. I know how the system's set up, so it is secure. I know also, however, if we screw up and something happens as a consequence that data gets out, we've gone backwards massive number of steps. If we could we recover? So it is a responsibility to hold that data, and we have to use it with sort of, you know, due deference. But also, people then expect us, you've got it, what are you doing with it, and how does it get there? And also, we're noticing to say it's the rage would be too strong a word, but the white male feels, I can't see how I can progress now since I don't tick any boxes. And that's become an increasing challenge for us, that we're saying, well, what's happening there? And in our staff surveys we do regularly, we're getting a few comments coming through on those, saying, well, I'm not sure, you know, I can't really progress in this company because you're going to focus all on diversity and not me. And so that's the other issue coming from it. So it's a plus and a minus there, but no, it's the data part went okay. It took 2 years to get there, though. The first year we got 60% fulfillment. The second year we got another 30%. We're still 10% missing there, which is probably about as good as it gets, we think. But as I said, assuming we can get admin sorted out, we will collect it at source when people join us. So over time, we'll get a bigger percentage.
And when you, in terms of the pay gap results, obviously, because you're asking, you know, colleagues to share their data with you, I suppose there is an expectation around transparency and openness. So what's the expectation with Wesleyan? Are you intending to, you know, share your results internally? Are you going to share them externally? There's no legal requirement at the moment. Just give us your thinking.
We're doing both. It's in, but we're doing a single number. So my sort of my ethnicity pay gap, I've got at a total level over all ethnic minorities. Some of the more detailed granular data underneath is more interesting and shows there might be some work for us to do. So, for example, I have a subset of BAME who seem to be assessed lower consistently across the board than others. Now, is that because of their ethnicity, or is it because of other things? We need to investigate that. Also, the data we're looking at after the events, as you won't know, Dan, the time to look at data is before I've made the decision, so I can do something about it then, rather than argue rationally why I did it or what I need to do in the future. So we're getting there, but I think with the data and faster systems to get it, we can then act. So, for example, if I have a long list, I could say I want diversity on the long list, please. And if I don't have that, please comply or explain. And what have you done about it? Don't just tell me they were the only people who applied, Roger. Well, I'm going to say you're going to have to look hard at them because I want more than that. And also relevance to our host for today, we're also squeezing our third parties who source us with candidates to say we want balance and diverse list, please.
Yeah, absolutely. And so sort of a comment, but then also sort of final question really is, doing the data and the analysis is not an end in itself. It's a means to something. So obviously this is about enabling you to be quite strategic around race inclusion, which can help to make decisions and the rest of it. So I'm kind of interested. I mean, you're doing some great stuff obviously on this. Where does this fit into your bigger picture? So what else are you doing in addition to data analysis and pay gap analysis in terms of progressing BME colleagues up the pipeline? And you've talked a lot about targets. Do you have particular programs, or just give us a sense of other activities to support your ambitions?
Our target for females, we've gone for 33% of our population will be female by 22 or 23, I forget the exact year. For BAME, we've gone for 15%. Now, the reason it's 15 is given our very low starting point there, we're down to about 4 or 5% by memory. That was an attainable target, although we all accept 15% is not the end point by anywhere at all. In Birmingham, for example, logically it would be 50. But we're also conscious there's a large amount of more activity to do outside because the pool of potential candidates is potentially less in that community, we believe. I'm not saying that's hard fact, but that's the evidence we have there. We're doing that, so we're making it clear what we're doing. We need to start looking at that data and start using the data more. We are very supportive of the networks. The network chairs have access to execs on a regular basis. They'll be appearing at our board and talking through their issues there. So we're doing all we can to include them. It's part of our Be Yourself at Work campaign there. So we can do it there. And also just help people learn and understand. I think we're about to do another webinar for the BAME community, say what they've got there. We've been a strong initiator in the Birmingham region of a BAME to BAME mentoring scheme. Which has probably got about 70 people involved in it now, being mentored by fellow BAMEs. And that's going well, with mentoring throughout has been good there. So there's a large amount of stuff happening. We're also looking at our pipelines as to what the splits are there. So at all levels, we're looking at the data and see what it says, and then work out where there are areas are below percentage or materially below percentage. What more do we need to do, and where do we think we might be there? It's not, as you would know, it's tread carefully as to what actions you take, but at least having the data means I've got hard evidence I can progress on, and my colleagues can progress on. We say we need to do more here and here. What can we do? We're also active, as are many other professional services companies in Birmingham, I think others as well, out in the community working with schools and etc. there to show them that companies like us are places for them to work, because part of the problem isn't the lack of qualifications, it's just that people don't believe we will ever have them working for. It's to change people's views at that stage, and you've got to go back to very young ages for that one. It's not just get them at uni and pick them up there. You've got to go much further back, because people think, well, you're just white, you're not going to take us. But
yeah, no,
we're now doing that and getting out there.
Okay, fab. We've got some questions in the chat. I'll leave those for now, because I think some of these questions will apply to both yourself and here at the same time, actually. Okay. Just for colleagues who are listening in, please do keep some questions coming, put them in the chat, because I will come back to those in a minute or two. Just before I hand over to Zaheer, I just want to go into the third poll, actually. So the third one, Roger's also talked quite a bit there around target setting. So the third poll is around targets. And the basic question is, we have set targets to increase the number of BAME individuals into management positions. So the poll will come up in a second. And if you have set targets yourself, obviously it's a simple yes there, no is a no, and if you're thinking about it or doing stuff, that's probably in progress. Okay, so we're almost at completion, and you can see the results there. We've got 5% of you saying that you have set targets, obviously 73% saying no targets, and 22% in progress. And I think that's interesting, because I think if we're saying 22% in progress, I'm making an assumption that therefore there's an intention to do so at some point. And I think actually when we come back to the discussion point, I think it is about thinking, what is the point of doing this pay analysis? And surely it's to drive our bigger strategies, and one ingredient to that would be targets. So it'd be also interesting to get Zaheer's view on what they're doing at EY. So with that, Zaheer, welcome. I'll hand over to you. Give us your story, what you're doing at EY, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you, Dan, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and talk to you all on this very important topic. Before I go into our journey, some of you may have seen the Business in the Community open letter to the Prime Minister, which was published today, signed by 30 business leaders, including EY Managing Partner Howell Ball. The letter calls on the PM to make ethnicity pay gap reporting mandatory. And I think it's only a matter of time before it becomes mandatory to report an ethnicity pay gap. Therefore, it sounds sensible to get on the front foot and build the infrastructures and the awareness to comply with the legislation. Let me also start by saying that it's a very topical issue at the moment. When we look at the race equality piece overall in the workplace across the board, there are many challenges around recruitment, retention, and progression. So this ethnicity pay gap reporting is just one piece of the puzzle that we need to solve, if I can put it that way. The expectation is for BAME colleagues, and when I say BAME, I recognize that it's not an homogeneous group, and there are differences of experiences that this group covers, but for the purpose of this conversation, I will refer to the group BAME, recognizing that it's not a homogeneous group. The expectation is for BAME colleagues to adjust, adopt, and alter themselves to fit in a culture that isn't designed by or for them. The debate around ethnicity pay gap has been around for some time, and it's just one part of the puzzle that we need to solve to advance race equality. It is one thing we can all unite behind, and it will be a massive step in the right direction if it becomes mandatory. Like Dan, let me also acknowledge the momentum, and like Roger, momentum created by Black Lives Matter movement and the injustice, racism, and discrimination our Black colleagues and communities face day in and day out. It's simply unacceptable for us to continue to ignore the pain and suffering of our Black communities. And since the rise in awareness and acknowledgement of racism in all its form in many countries, and since both Black people, non-Black allies, which includes me, are finally in agreement of the fact that things need to change systemically and economically, we must not let this moment die or let it be a movement that just goes away. We must channel this moment towards targeted change. And also, let me now turn my attention to the pay gap. The aim of the pay gap reporting is to understand and overcome the barriers that may prevent all our people from achieving their full potential and making their maximum contribution to the economy, which is why in 2017, EY chose to voluntarily publish its ethnicity pay gap. Last year, for the first time, we published our disability and sexual orientation pay gap. This year, as part of our anti-racism commitment, we will be releasing our Black pay gap alongside our ethnicity pay gap. And we encourage other organizations to do the same, to give appropriate focus to all underrepresented talent groups. Understanding our own pay gap information was a key milestone on our journey to become a leading inclusive organization. It's one of the ways we see where we can do more to achieve parity across the firm. We believe the future of our business depends on our ability to innovate for our clients. This requires us to recognize and harness the most diverse range of thoughts, experiences, and skills. The best talent is our competitive advantage. Big changes in the future world of work demand new skills and talents, which makes it harder to attract, engage, and develop people from new and diverse talent pools. Our clients expect us to represent our shared world in the diversity of our workforce and the clients and the communities we serve. So when it came to ethnicity pay gap, there were three key things for us. First one, like Dan and Rogers talked about, data. Reporting reporting on ethnicity pay gap relies on the collection of meaningful data about employees' ethnicity. As things stands, EY's ethnicity disclosure rate is close to 90%. We've achieved this over a number of years. Second thing, it's the narrative. What is the data telling you? Where is the gap and how you're going to communicate this with your stakeholders? Third is the vision. What is the vision when we look at this data of, what is the organization vision? Put simply, how will we close the gap? There were, again, three things we looked at. First, when we made a decision to disclose or publish our ethnicity pay gap. First one was the reputation of our organization. Some organization in my recent conversation believe that releasing the ethnicity pay gap, because it's going to paint a very bad picture, will damage their reputation. We will have pay gap. EY will have a pay gap depending on our relative position to others and how we articulate the position. What we're doing on the wider D&I agenda, publishing our pay gap could enhance our reputation. That's what we believed in. Second piece was about employee relations, and Roger and Dan earlier talked about transparency. Increased transparency is broadly likely to be seen as a positive by our people. However, the term pay gap has often been confused with equal pay. Increased focus on pay gap could give rise to more scrutiny regarding equal pay. The final piece was around the business impact. Focusing on activities that reduce the pay gap should increase the diversity of our firm. In turn, this should enable us to further attract, retain, and maximize the best talent. Our pay gap vision was quite very simple, if you like. Our ambition is to be a leading disruptive voice on diversity and inclusion. This extends to leading on pay equity. We pay all employees on the basis of their experience, contribution, and performance. We support transparency of pay reporting, and transparency is the key to building trust and increasing accountability. Our pay gap figures are not a reflection of EY paying people differently for the same work. Rather, it largely reflects differences in demographic distributions across EY, both in terms of roles and seniority. Our efforts are intended to address those differences, and we will use this metric, the pay gap metric, to demonstrate our progress over time. We will also scrutinize any like-for-like pay differences in order to ensure that we have no unjustified differences. The way our managing partner, when we released our last year pay gap data, there was a very powerful line that he said, which is, "We're proud of our progress, but not satisfied." I'm going to pause there, Dan, and just invite any questions, because I would like to go into a little bit more details on the data side, but I just want to be guided by yourself.
Fab, brilliant. Well, look, brilliant actually, and I love that final quote, which is satisfied but more to do, essentially. So there's lots of questions coming in the chat, which is great, and I've got a whole bunch for you and Roger. Just a quick reflection, actually, just to start off with. I was making some notes, which I think people might be curious to know. Is you talked about when you released the data, reducing your data first of all in relation to Black employees. So maybe an obvious question, which people might be wondering, is, why is that? Obviously there might be some pay disproportionality in relation to Asian employees and other colleagues. So just give us your logic for what the reason is behind that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and we made our commitment to release the Black Pay Gap data this year as part of our anti-racism commitments, because we believe that, as I said earlier, transparency key to building the trust, and we wanted to increase our to enhance our relationship and our trust and confidence that our Black colleagues have in us, that we're doing the right thing and we're focusing on areas which will drive diversity. I personally believe, yes, I think there will come a time very soon in the future where I will see organization releasing ethnicity data on all categories. And we apply the UK census categories when we collate our ethnicity data. And within that, you have the mixed category, you have the Asian, Black, and other. So those four key categories, under which there are subcategories, but on starting with those four, it would be something that will become it will become quite regular, I feel, and there will be. I'm just hoping that there will be one or two organisations that will start the way, pave the way, where they will set the trail for others to follow. So, Black Pay Gap is our ambition to be absolutely transparent when it comes to our Black talent and our Black communities, and it helps us understand better where the improvements needs to be made when it comes to our Black talent.
Cool. And there might be a couple of people who have registered for the session to think about what are the practicalities in terms of the actual mechanism. So if you just suggested, look, there's probably 3 or 4 key stages. So stage 1 might be communicating to people why you need to collect, then go into the collection. Can you just very high level, if you were to recommend to any colleagues listening, what would be the kind of key stages to make this happen?
Yes, I'll try my best. I think data is the key. And data is absolutely fundamentally key to this. That's the first step. And it needs to be meaningful data. It needs to be good quality data. And linked to the data is, like Roger said, and you've alluded to this, is what the data is telling you. How you're going to use that data to inform your decision making. And in EY, we follow a number of steps. Our data generated by HR analytics, for example, then the confirmation is from payroll provider to certify the data provided. Then there is an independent review by our in-house talent team to check the data set and reports provided are correct. Then there is an independent review by our in-house legal team on how the regulations have been interpreted for the gender piece, but we follow the same 6 components, and we release the data on the 6 components for ethnicity, as we are required to do for gender pay gap as well. And then the final review is by our in-house branding and marketing team. So it's quite a rigorous process that we have to go through. But going back to the earlier comment Roger made, that data disclosure is very important for and it takes time. You need to, transparency is the key of building trust with your colleagues. Your networks and communities are key to driving engagement, but when we set the scene, we need to be absolutely clear, transparent. Why are we asking for data? What are we going to do with the data? And those reassurances are very, very important. But I've not come across an organization in my entire career that have had a huge spike over a short period of time, where they've gone from 10% over 60 or whatever the number might be. It's an incremental increase you get over a period of time, but you got to keep at it through various different comms, through engagement with internal stakeholders, through conversations on a local level, because sometimes centrally driven initiatives don't really have an impact in a big organization. So through locally driven initiatives as well, there are various different ways you can increase the data disclosure, because data is the key to understanding what's going on in your organization when it comes to the BAME piece. So I say data is powerful, and I'm happy to share, if there is time, that how we use the data to inform our decision making.
Okay, fab. And we wouldn't expect anything less from EY, but it sounds like a very thorough process in terms of those stages. Absolutely. So I'm going to invite Roger back in a second, but we'll just before I do go into the final Q&A, we'll just have the final poll actually. So the final poll is really around how colleagues feel prepared. So how prepared are we? So we feel prepared for the ethnicity pay reporting requirement. So you'll see the poll coming up there. So if you do feel prepared, obviously it's an agree. Not prepared, it's disagree, and probably a little bit or a bit confident. It's a kind of neither. Interestingly. Well, we've got some initial results here. I think we're oscillating on about 50% disagreeing, which I think is really quite fascinating actually in terms of really feeling prepared. So there we go with the final result. So 51 not feeling prepared or unconfident, I guess. 33 maybe a bit, and then 13 not so. It would be interesting, and maybe colleagues can put anything in the chat, but it'd be interesting in terms of those that don't feel prepared, whether you have done the gender pay reporting and whether you feel that ethnicity pay reporting is more complex, because obviously we have a model for this with gender reporting, or whether you're completely new to this. So it'd be interesting to get some insight from that. So let's invite Zaheer back, and also with Roger, and then we can go into a more of a broader discussion. I've got a whole bunch of questions for you, but in the spirit of fairness, I will have a look at the questions in the chat, because there's lots there. So we'll just have a quick look in terms of what's coming up. Some fairly straightforward ones, and then maybe some more complex ones. One is maybe to Roger, actually. I know you talked about this, and I know we've spoken about this before, but how did you engage the business? So someone's saying, as a HR practitioner, you know, sometimes it feels that it's kind of left to HR to deal with this. And you've obviously kind of talked about moving it away from a HR responsibility to a leadership one. Give us your thoughts around that.
It was very much, having got the go-ahead from board and the exec team, it was just get on with it, basically. So communication, announce what you're going to do, follow it through. A bit of large razzmatazz to start with, it's fair to say. We encourage the network to do sort of fairly brash, over-the-top events just to get themselves noticed. Name check them when they're doing it there, and just start it and start the conversations. You know, you've got to start somewhere, and that's it. Sounds crude, it sounds a bit simplistic, but you've got to start from somewhere, so that get us there. Now, interestingly, they've earned the right. So what we did early on was very much like it's a gender week this week, so we did various activities led by the gender network. We've moved on now, so that was pure for name awareness. We've now got the name awareness, and now they're focusing on, they're running seminars similar to this actually on sort of gender pay or items like that there, as is the BAME network, as are the other networks. They've earned the right to do that, and people turn up and people expect it there. So it's, you've got to go along a sort of a maturity curve basically, and the first is just get yourselves noticed. But the other thing to remember is you can't start then stop. You've got to start. I've always said it's like a Pandora's box. Once you say you're doing this, it's a one-way door. You can start it, you can't stop it, because your people will expect it of you, and they will hold you to account and keep you honest. So you can't say you're going to do it then do nothing. That's actually worse than actually not doing anything at all in my book there. So it's just go for it, and just don't be shy in the exec. And also you do need supportive chair and CEO, which I've had at all times. They're happy to let you get on with it, and they raise it. And you know, it was in the first year we did it, the opening part of the chairman's note in the annual report was focused on diversity, which was great. You didn't ask for that, but you chose to do it that way. So I think you can do it in small, subtle ways, but it's just build yourself up. I'm sure Zaheer's got other examples as well.
Yeah, no, thanks, Roger. And Zaheer, we know that in terms of Roger's point about leadership, we know that the leadership of EY are absolutely committed to this. Probably a couple of questions in one, Zaheer, actually. One is around, you know, obviously we want to capture data. So there's a question here about can we make it compulsory? That's an interesting question in terms of how do we really capture the data. But there's another, probably a fairly technical question, which is hopefully easy to. So someone's talked about white other. So in terms of white other, do you capture that and you know, how do you treat that? Do you treat them as white, or do you treat them as white other? So does the white other come into the ethnicity pay reporting essentially? Let's start with that technical one first, and then we can go to the.
Yep, we do capture the white other. Because it's part of the first category within the UK census category, but you know that for us, BAME is everything else and the white and the other. But when we draw comparisons, because that's where it becomes interesting, because BAME ethnicity data on its own is not going to tell you much unless you can have some comparison with the other, particularly the white majority group. So we do capture it and we do it with the view of doing the comparisons, but also to understanding what's happening with our white colleagues as well. The second piece is sorry, could you remind me, Dan? What was the second?
Yeah, the second piece was more around the kind of whole can we make it compulsory and how, or you know, all of that.
That's an interesting one, isn't it? Because ultimately we got to respect the individual's rights to disclose or not. I've always believed that I don't believe there will be an organization that will have 100% disclosure rate. There will be individuals who will choose for whatever, and there could be a number of reasons not to disclose, whether it's the ethnicity or any other diversity characteristics. And I think we should respect that right, that personal choice, and not go down the route of compulsory. I personally, and in my experience, I believe the organization wants to take the easier route, and compulsory, let's get it done, rather than go on a journey of engagement and conversation in a very transparent, open and honest way to encourage their colleagues, because it's very powerful when somebody wants to tell you voluntarily who they are, rather than being forced to tell you. So I think we must not go down the route of, maybe there is an argument and there's a wider debate, but it needs to be looked at, and there needs to be a conversation around that to understand better how, if it's going to be intrusive, and I personally, I don't follow the point just yet, because I think many organizations are not doing the basics. So to go towards the extreme other end, it's not something that I would be encouraging, and not something that we would be doing. With as you can see, I said 90%, which is pretty high. Yes, we can go higher. Never will be 100%.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. I mean, in my 25 years of consulting, I've never known any organisation to have 100% actually. Roger, I think you mentioned you were up to, like, I think it was 90%. You said actually, which is, that's great. That's fabulous. In terms of experience.
Yeah, I mean exactly the same spaces are here on this. It shouldn't be made compulsory, which is also a message to all those of you who said no, you haven't taken any activity to do it. If the government introduces it, they're liable to do it fairly fast. If the government doesn't think of reality often when it says what it wants done, it says, "Oh, I've got this idea. Please do this. Do it." So do start collecting your data, because otherwise you'll be left rushing around, and it will be very painful to do, or you'll just have a large amount of unknown, basically, which is probably the easy route there. But also, I found that people have responded seriously and sensibly in what they've done. They've actually haven't gamed the system. They've actually put in their own ethnicity. We've had very few in the refuse to say box. We've had very few in this sort of generic box, and we're getting good quality data from it there. So okay, that comes from trust, which you've got to keep. But I think that's the best you can get there. So overall, data, I don't think you can force it. And if you did, I'm not sure what quality it'd be. Someone could just put stupid stuff in then. But we think getting it to 90s pretty good, and we'll do what we can to get more, but we have to accept where we are there for the same reasons as here is. It's a personal choice. But as I said, the people thinking, oh, might people invent a category, they've been pretty good so far, apart from a couple of items we were challenged on our data collection, where we had screwed up actually, in terms of categories, not on the BAME one, it's fair to say. Then we've been okay.
No, 90% is great actually. So yeah, you can consider that. There's a couple of questions I've got, and there's some others which are in the chat which I really do want to pull out. One of the questions I had was around intersectionality. There's a really interesting report from McKinsey talking about when we breaking down the ethnicity pay data, we do see disparities between black males and black females, for example. So I've got two parts to my question, really. So part one is, are you, aggregating data by things like ethnicity and gender? But there is a question which is in the chat, which is the EHRC are recommending organisations to do pay reporting on gender, ethnicity, disability, and sexual orientation. So rather than say, okay, well, let's do gender, then let's go on to ethnicity, etc., etc. Is there any thinking in either organisations? Zaheer, I think EY, if I'm correct, and you'll correct me otherwise if I'm wrong, have started the process already on sexual orientation.
We were released that last year, Dan.
Right.
So we released data on sexual orientation and disability last year for the first time. So at the moment, this year, when we release the data in the coming weeks, it'll be gender as required by law, ethnicity, which will include our black pay gap, we will have sexual orientation, and we will have disability.
Okay, great. And
pay gap as
Roger,
well.
in terms of Wesleyan, are you moving towards those other strands as well?
I worry about the small amounts of data going through. So at the current time, we have the ability to do it. Yes. Are we doing it? No, not yet. But I think sexuality is probably the next one we go for. Disability is still doesn't really worry the scores too much from what we've got declared there. And so I think we can do it that way. I think there's a great danger that sort of we end up too granular on data and end up with large amounts of data which doesn't tell us anything. I'm happy with gender overall. I'm happy with BAME overall. Then do I do my 2-by-2 matrix to put the two together? Do I then make another dimension with sexuality on top? Do I make a fourth dimension, put disability and everything else on top? I think that's almost. I think you're forgetting what we're trying to do here, and this is steering and guiding us there. And also, it feeds the answers who say, well, you've got to have someone in each box, and you are missing a person in this particular box here, or there's an issue there. Please focus on it. And for a very large firm, if you're EY worldwide, EY is probably helpful to do it there, although cultures in countries might make it invalid. For a company like Wesleyan, we've got 1,400 people, so I've got reasonable data. I'll end up with very small sales there, and I'm not sure I would wish to go down the track of tracking the data there. I think you've got to be careful what you ask for and what you deliver. Otherwise, I think you'll end up feeding those who actually want to stop you doing it for asking what they think, what they argue are logical questions, but are actually leading you down a route which you're not too sure where you're going to end up.
Okay, fab. Thanks, Roger. I'm super conscious of time, and I do want to try and get through as many questions as we can. There is an interesting question here, which I'll take chair's liberty and answer, and then invite you both in if you want to disagree. Because one is around with regards to targets for companies with offices in different parts of the UK. Would the recommendation to have different targets for various locations to reflect local populations? I think the sensible answer to that is yes, and I'll give a very quick story, which many years ago I was asked to do a race review for a government department. They had, you might be able to guess this to government department when I give you the locations, but they had an office in Newport in Wales, one in Liverpool, an office in London, and they had a tiny office in down in Devon, actually. And they set a civil service target, which was about 10% or 12% actually for race inclusion. Now, if you go to Devon, or did go many years ago, the BME population at that point was 0.3%. So trying to have a 10% target in Devon was obviously unrealistic. So I think the sensible answer is, of course, we've got to be proportionate in terms of the local jurisdictions, in terms of targets and all of that. Any quick reflections from either of you in terms of that?
In principle, yes, but it depends where you set your target. Because if it's a lowish target, you look at underlying data. I mean, I get the Devon argument from your example there, Dan. But if our target's 15, we've got offices elsewhere than Birmingham. It's an overall target for us total. But an office level, I think 15 is not unreasonable based on local data. But I buy the theory, but it's sort of where's your overall target set and does it fit basically there. It's not an issue we've dealt with yet, but I think it should arise if you get very localized in your data. So Birmingham versus Oswestry, for example, two offices for us. Birmingham should have a higher number than Oswestry.
Okay.
Very briefly, I think targets we do believe targets can be a key driver in enabling success and can be a useful tool to support organizations. But I don't believe that every organization believes in setting targets. And as you were talking, Dan, and I was listening to Roger as well, I was wondering if it complicates the case for targets even further for organizations. To put simply, yes, I do believe if there is a way to set localized or region-based targets that reflects the representation of the communities in that part of the world, then yes, it makes sensible and logical. It's logical and sensible to do it. But I just don't think it's something that organizations who perhaps are starting their race journey, or maybe just grappling with the race inclusion. It would be helpful to go down the path of setting localized targets, but I do follow the point, because I think there will come some point in the future we will probably see this happening. But at the moment, where we are on our race journey in the country, I think it's probably something that won't go down well with the organization, because then which data set you're going to look at to set the local target, and then the conversation around the data and the talent pipeline or supply will also be called into question. So I think there are various different parts that we need to look at. It's not as simple as straight as saying set a local target for you use the example of Devon and Cornwall. Well, that's absolutely fine, but then we looked at other data sets for the local area to ensure that we are able to meet that target or not? So not a straightforward button, but I follow the point. I'm inclined to support it.
Okay, great, fab. So look, almost right at the top, probably got about maybe just over 60 seconds. So there is one question about comms. Maybe a final reflection, Zaheer, from yourself. Maybe one piece of advice. If there's one thing that you would encourage organisations to do, what would that one piece of advice be? And then Roger, same for you.
Build trust. I would say that build trust with your colleagues, and be absolutely transparent. When there is transparency, enhances trust and confidence in what the organization is trying to do. That will ultimately lead to a greater engagement from our BAME communities, from our LGBT plus communities, and various other groups. So my key takeaway from this would be to build trust, be absolutely transparent. That will drive engagement and help us move the dial on inclusion overall, but on race inclusion in this context.
Okay, fab. And Roger, I think you've got about 1 second. But
Okay. Very much the same as here. It's set out to people what it is you're trying to do and keep focused on it.
Yeah, fab. Well, look, first of all, thank you both very much. I mean, this is clearly a really important topic. We've all said it's always been important, actually, but it's more critical now because of George Floyd. There is a real expectation from BME colleagues for organisations to get this right. It's obviously just the right thing to do anyway. So thank you for sharing your stories and practical tips and the rest of it. I think I'm handing back to Jonathan just to do a final thank you and close. But thank you all very much for joining in your questions.
Thank you, Dan.
Well, really, just to follow on from Dan's comments, really appreciate you all joining us today, and thank you to Dan, Zaheer, and Roger for providing a very informative discussion on what is a really important topic. So appreciate everybody joining us today. Thank you.
If you found this video helpful for your recruitment journey, why not subscribe to our channel? And don't forget to tap the bell to get the latest videos first.